Disclaimer: the views and opinions expressed in this program are those of the speakers and do not necessarily reflect the views or positions of any entities they represent. Listener discretion is advised. One of the joys of being a podcaster is getting to share some of my most favorite podcasts. 2023 brought me back to music more times than I realized on the show, which in turn fed my hunger for nostalgia. Never being one to shy away from my own mistakes, I have mistakenly stated that 90s music in particular would be really hard to feel nostalgic for because it felt like it never went away. Enter Rob Harvilla and his wonderful podcast and recently released book, 60 Songs That Explain the 90s. Today I welcome Rob onto my show and we have a fantastic conversation reminiscing about that decade. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Caught on the Mic. Ladies and gentlemen, I have pondered this several times on the podcast before with past guests because it felt like even though I spent my teen years and early 20s in the 90s, that 90s nostalgia was never coming full circle. Until about 2 years ago, it just hit me all at once. I threw up a Facebook post talking about the New Radicals, You Get What You Give, and somebody responded to me with, "Hey, have you ever heard this podcast called 60 Songs That Explain the 90s? And I immediately went to that podcast episode, checked it out, and it was fantastic. I have been a listener ever since. There's also now an accompanying book with the same title, and I am pleased to welcome Rob Harvilla, the host and author of 60 Songs That Explain the 90s. How you doing, man?
I'm great, man. Thanks for having me. The You Get What You Give episode was an emergency episode because they played Joe Biden's virtual inauguration. Remember how weird that was? But like no one had heard from those dudes for years, decades or whatever. And you found out about that like 72 hours before it happens. Like, we have to do an episode on this right now. So that was a rush job. And so I'm relieved if that was the first one you heard and you were not immediately repelled by it.
No, I have like this weird nostalgia relationship with that song myself. And It's like, I'll never say that it's like a great song, but I'm not going to say it's a bad song. The comparison that I kind of make with it, and I think you have to watch the video to understand it, is it does create a certain timestamp in the 90s that is unmistakable, even though it didn't sound like anything that came out in the 90s. I typically call it the Everybody Wants to Rule the World of the 90s.
Oh, I love that song so much. That would be a great honor to You Get What You Give. They're in a mall, right? Isn't the video in a mall? Yes. So there you go. That's why it's you wouldn't have thought at the time of the mall as a nostalgic, as a retrospective entity, but 20 years later, Stranger Things sets scenes in a mall and you're like, the mall. I remember. Right. Yeah, that's very funny.
Right. And then you have the retail apocalypse that's going on right now. So malls are pretty much dying. So
it's too bad. I miss a good food court. You know what I mean? Like the chicken, the bourbon chicken samples. That was one of my favorite things about the mall. Just walk back and forth in front of that lady 4 or 5 times until she recognizes you.
I know that exercise all too well. That is spending time in the Sam Goodies and the
Camelot, E. Dalton.
Yes. So without any further ado, let me kind of pass it over to you, and why don't you introduce yourself and let's talk a little bit about your origin story.
Oh, my origin story. Well, let's see. I've been doing the podcast since 2020, since late 2020. It's the first thing like this I've ever done. I've been a working rock critic for 20 years. I grew up mostly in Ohio in a suburb of Cleveland. I started out writing for alt-weeklies, alternative weeklies, which are still around but are far less prevalent now than they were, in the year 2000. Written for a bunch of websites, magazines, stuff like that. I've been at The Ringer since it launched in 2016. But I've been a writer almost exclusively in all that time, in the first 20 years. But I started the podcast, it was very much a pandemic type exercise, right? Like I'm just barricaded in my house with my children and I need somebody to talk to, but no one will talk to me. So I just talk to myself, and release the tapes. Basically, this has been by far, my favorite thing I've ever done and the most feedback I've ever gotten. And a lot of that I put down, as you know well, the parasocial type nature of podcasting, right? Like just the connection that you forge with somebody that you've never met and you never will meet just because they have your voice in their ear. It's just been a really cool thing, and then the book, like my episodes are scripted, right? They're monologues, I guess, and I have a guest, an interview at the end, but it is mostly me talking. And for the book, I had like 600,000 words of raw material that I had to radically distill down to normal book size, but it was a cool challenge, and to take 120 songs from the 90s and see if I could get them interacting with each other, in unexpected ways. It's cool to sort of jump from medium to medium and see what I can keep the same and see what I have to keep different. And hopefully the book is interesting to people, who don't even know the show at all. It's not like you need to know the show to get the book or vice versa.
So our options are pretty diversified these days with streaming. How did you land on the 90s as being your topic?
I don't know what my initial rationalization was, but in time, what I realized is because I'm like you, I grew up in the 90s, right? I was a teenager in the 90s, high school and college. And I think that's the whole ball game right there. The one thing that I know for sure, and I've said, is like the music you loved when you were a teenager is the music you'll love most in your life. That's no offense to the music you're listening to now. And it's not that you don't love music anymore, but there's something very specific, and you can't replicate that teenage experience, of it soundtracking those years and the mind meld, that I had with Billy Corgan or whoever it was. Just I cannot and would not want to, frankly, replicate that with anybody else at this point in my life. So I think that's what drew me to the 90s, even if that I couldn't have articulated that at the time.
An observation that I've had in particularly, as I talk a lot about the 90s being the Lollapalooza era because it was such a melting pot of so many different styles. Young enough to be able to appreciate it, but old enough to somewhat remember it. The late 80s, it seemed like music was very much fragmented. It was like if you listened to heavy metal, you were listening to heavy metal. If you listen to hair metal, you listen to hair metal, hip hop, so on and so on. But when Lollapalooza launched in 91, it seems like Perry Farrell really kind of created that melting pot in the mainstream. Is that an observation that you've had as well? And how did that, from your perception, affect all genres of music?
I think the atomization did start happening in the 90s, and Lollapalooza is a great example, right? Like putting Susie and the Banshees and Ice Cube, on the same bill. Like that was legitimately sort of a revolutionary idea. Rage Against the Machine is rap and rock. It's not like they were the first, but they were so huge, so popular, so influential that it could feel like, they invented, the idea of cross genres in that way. It's interesting, the late 80s. Yeah, I agree with you. I think a lot of it is, you had to buy records, right? You had to buy CDs, and so you buy one CD for $20 and now you're stuck with this thing and you're going to play it over and over again. I think that encouraged that kind of tribalization, and that you do end up, sticking to your lane and what and what you like. Whereas now, like, streaming services, whatever, you can put any song, on Spotify, on YouTube, whatever, like you can dabble in everything to a degree that financially, logistically, you could not, certainly in the late 80s, but really through the whole 90s. Like, another interesting thing to me about the 90s is that they're basically pre-internet. The internet's around, Napster appears late in the decade, but it's not until the early 2000s when Napster destroys, the music industry. I do think that it does appeal to me and fascinate me in retrospect, the idea that, like, you're a person with 10 CDs, that you just listen to over and over again. And again, I do think that lends itself to that sort of, I know that I like hip hop. I know that I like hair metal. I don't want to spend $20 to find out that I don't like something else,
Right.
So it does lead you to silo yourself off a little bit more than people are now.
Yeah. Yeah. It's interesting you brought up Napster. Are you in the camp that firmly believes that file sharing and Napster was kind of the domino that caused the industry to fall down, or the industry that we knew to fall down?
Yeah. I mean, it's the NSYNC record, right? I think it's the 2000 NSYNC record sells like that's the record to this day, I think, still for most albums, sold in a week. I don't remember what it is offhand, but like that's the peak of the music industry. That's the peak of the CD era, right? And then post Napster, it falls off a cliff. And I guess there's some, you know, other things happening, but I do think that Napster pretty explicitly, the idea that music could be free, that you could type, something into a box, and it's hilarious in retrospect how arduous it was, especially if you're on dial-up or whatever. Like, I just remember watching those bars fill up, to get this Radiohead song or whatever. Like, it's funny how inconvenient it was in retrospect, but how rad and revolutionary it felt at the time. So you can say that there's other things happening, but I do think, just explicitly, undeniably, music suddenly being free on the internet had a cataclysmic effect, on, the record store in the mall that very quickly no longer existed.
A fair counterbalance to that, one that I feel you brought up in one of your episodes, was 1998. That was the year of the one-hit wonder, where there was something from all over the place, tons and tons and tons of one-hit wonders. Do you ever consider that maybe there was a lot of bloated signings by the big record labels from the mid 90s on that also contributed to that? Because you look at the second half of the 90s, man, there's a shit ton of one-hit wonders.
There are, and there are always one-hit wonders, and I do think that's another place where being a teenager makes you more attuned, more passionate about your particular era of one-hit wonders. But no question, 97, 98 is when you get like How Bizarre, like Tub Thumping, I Steal My Sunshine, I think, was 99. I think You Get What You Give was in that frame as well. There is a quality that those songs have. And so you're absolutely right that post Nirvana, right, there's this gold rush where like any band gets signed, and we burned through those for the first half of the 90s. And then in 1994, partly, the passing of Kurt Cobain, partly just the sort of the natural waning of grunge, of alternative rock, of Lollapalooza culture, as you said, there's a hangover a little bit. And I do, bloated is the way to put it. Like the other thing, Napster felt like poetic justice,
right?
For a music industry that had made you spend $20 because you wanted to hear, Standing Outside a Phone Booth with Money in My Hands by Primitive Radio Gods, right? Like, I haven't heard that whole record. Maybe it's great, but like just not being able to buy just that song. We were headed toward this moment where the music industry was going to pay for that eventually. But yeah, I've talked a lot about that, about just the weirdest. It felt extra weird.
Yeah.
The late 90s, right in that vacuum between, right before like boy bands took over, the Britney Spears of it all took over in earnest, right before nu metal took over as far as rock was concerned. There is something about that time period that was just singularly, bizarre.
I'm glad you brought both of those up as well, because it felt like the boy band era and the nu metal era were an overcorrection of that, because they did the same exact thing. If you were a decent, passable nu metal band, you got a record deal,
Yep.
So it's kind of crazy. So what was the genesis of your music fandom? Like, who turned you on to music and got you going?
It would have to be my parents. Like my parents' record collection, I've talked about a lot. The Cars was the first band I ever loved. That first Cars record with like Just What I Needed on it and stuff. Like I would listen to that obsessively as like a 2-year-old, 3-year-old, 4-year-old, and this is vinyl era, right? Like this is early mid 80s, and so that's still happening. And the physical sort of quality of being able to like hold the album and like look at the liner notes and how scary these people looked. Like Steely Dan, man, there's a Steely Dan record where it's a photo of them on the back, and it's not just the two dudes, it's like the whole band that made this record, and they look terrifying.
Right.
They look like they're going to beat you up. It's like, I don't want to deal with it, but I'm fascinated by them at the same time, right? And so I got into music that way, in the vinyl era, in the MTV era. It cannot be overstated, the importance of MTV to me, right. And how, with apologies to my parents, MTV raised me. It almost feels like, and then in high school, or even in junior high, I start reading Rolling Stone, right? And I decide like, I want to be a rock. I want to write for Rolling Stone. That's all I wanted to go to college to do. That's all I ever wanted to do professionally, and so it's always been that way. But I would have to take it all the way back to my parents' record collection and like driving around with my mom, listening to the radio. Like those are the formative foundational moments.
In the No Doubt episode of your podcast, you mentioned a brief period of time where you played bass in a ska band. So were you a musician your whole life, or did you just pick up bass to play later on in college?
I talk about this way too much, man, relative to like the impact that we had at the time. But this has made a big impression on me. Let's see here. I took piano lessons as a kid, right? And I played a little piano in high school. Like I accompanied the choir once, that I was in, and that was very cool. But like nothing serious, not recitals, nothing real. But late in high school, maybe even the summer between high school and college, like my buddy needed a bass player, and I picked up a bass for the first, and that was like a rock band, right? Like a pop rock, Pearl Jam, etc. type situation. But no, the ska band was my freshman year of college, and it was right in that moment. And again, this too was 96 into 97. Like that, the ska moment, the mighty, mighty Boss Tones of it all is part of like the randomness. Like the Boss Tones have a huge successful career, but like the impression that I get sort of stands as a one hit, in the pop world, and that's in that time frame as well. But so that technically the ska band I was in was the second band I'd ever played bass in, but I'd only been playing for a year or so. I certainly wasn't very good at it, but it's so funny that the dudes I were playing with had been in ska bands before, and I think were way more about that life. Like they didn't just pick this up because ska got popular on MTV, right? Like they were onto it beforehand, but not me, man. I was just on the bandwagon, and I was enjoying the hell out of it. And you too played in a ska band, and this is delightful to hear.
Oh my gosh, because it's so funny, because the band I was in, we went from like playing Bush and Smashing Pumpkins covers to being a ska band almost overnight. And it really was.
That's how you do it.
It almost was really disingenuous as far as honoring the craft, but
the craft of ska. Don't take it so hard.
Oh man, that's hilarious. Post-pandemic era, a lot of people are focusing on their mental health. And I've noticed personally, maybe I'm alone in this, that people's relationship with nostalgia has really changed. And maybe it's just the age that we're coming into right now. Do you feel that nostalgia at large, especially since you're kind of retelling stories about the 90s, is a healthy thing, or loaded question?
No, it's a good question. That's a really interesting question. The show itself, the podcast itself, is very much a product of the
Mm-hmm.
pandemic. It started in late 2000, late 2020,
Mm-hmm.
right? So the first Christmas, the first fall of the pandemic. And we're barricaded in my house. My wife is pregnant. We got two boys already. We're not going out at all. This seems like a good time, just to remember some jams from my youth,
Mm-hmm.
when
Mm-hmm.
things were better. And people, it's so disingenuous to talk about the 90s as like a halcyon era, of peace and prosperity, because that's not true in retrospect. Like that's way oversimplifying it, for a lot of people, for most people. But I do think that just, the 90s has always felt, even if it's untrue, felt like sort of apolitical or less political, or
Right.
certainly less fraught day to day, moment to moment, than the existence we're in now. And partly that's Twitter, right? Like that's the internet. Having access to everyone's thoughts and anxieties and like furies all day does not help matters. But I do, especially within the pandemic and beyond the pandemic, we're still not locked down, but very tentative about that stuff. It
Right.
doesn't feel over for us. And so I do still sort of feel like there's this oasis, of calm that I get from the 90s, that's fraudulent. And I know it's fraudulent, but I can't help myself. But that's interesting. I'm sure, an excess of nostalgia is a bad thing, of course, anything is, but just, again, like oversimplifying the 90s to back when everything was perfect and everyone was happy is just absolute bullshit. And, you can take that too far so fast. But I do think that there is value in a certain amount, of trying to revel in that stuff, and especially in, the good memories of your teenage years or whatever, but also trying to contextualize it, like I never want to be on the show like the 2020 guy scolding, the
Right.
90s people, like a Mad Men type thing where it's like, look how much better we have it. But like
Right.
you read like the press, you read Fiona Apple's press or Tori Amos's press or Sinead O'Connor's, and just the way that people used to talk, about these women in particular, and you just sort of cringe, and I do think that to some extent, to a modest extent, you can use that, to find better ways of listening to this music and treating these people in the present, from a mental health perspective, from any perspective, and so this show is built on, is fueled by nostalgia, and there's no getting around that. And I think it is the case for me of just figuring out how much of it is too much, because too much of it is bad, and so we're going for just enough.
Yes, I get that all too well. I
Yeah,
accidentally, on purpose, might have traded a little bit too much nostalgia on my own show because I started
sure.
my show at the same time. It was fall of 2020. And I'm like, man,
Hmm.
I need something to do. I need something to do creatively. And it's like,
Exactly.
I was in the music business for 15 years. Why not like
Yeah,
exercise all the connections that I had made in different areas? And of course, I'm going to lean on nostalgia. I'm going to kind of trip people's memories of a time where
of
they
course.
felt better. But made I've always made it a point to avoid politics, avoid religion, avoid anything that's
Sure.
divisive, but
Yeah.
maintaining a certain sense of integrity and sincerity in the stories that I tell. So
Yeah.
I totally agree with you. It's a delicate balance, isn't it?
It is. Yeah, yeah. And it's this is a silly show at the heart of it, right? Like I'm the same way with you, I don't want to talk politics or religion, or talk about the pandemic at all, for
Right.
all that the pandemic has obviously affected, is sort of a catalyst of this show in the first place. It's come up in passing a couple of times, but like I don't want the real world to intrude, and I guess it's a case of understanding, that I can keep out the real world, but that the real world still exists, and it's still the world we're living in, and like we can spend, a half hour, 45 minutes or whatever reminiscing about you get what you give, as long as we get back to the real world
Yeah,
eventually.
absolutely. So, of all the episodes that you've done, do you have a personal favorite?
Yeah, the Tom Petty episode that I did is one of the first. It was on "It's Good to Be King"
Mm-hmm.
off the Wildflowers record, and that's the first one of the first ones I did where I talked a little more personally, like about my family, like about my kids. I don't want to do that too much for a variety of reasons, but like
Right.
I felt like that one turned out all right in that sense. They Might Be Giants is one of my favorite groups of all time. And I had gone back and forth on whether it would be too indulgent to do a whole episode on them. But for the 100th episode of this show, it's like, I deserve this,
Right.
And so that was really gratifying to do. Like I had avoided the Macarena episode forever, right? Because I don't want the Macarena stuck in my head for 2 weeks. And I did it. And the Macarena got stuck in my head for 2 weeks. But like I enjoyed all that way more than I thought I would. I that was a way cooler journey, and sort of learning just a little bit about these dudes, and where they came from and like how random and unexpected, and out of their control all of that was. Like that was a really cool story. And, I had a lot more fun doing that than I imagined that I would have.
There was an episode you did recently, well, this past fall, that I don't know how you got there, but it was amazing, where you were covering Black Hole Sun by Soundgarden, and you tied it into Smash Mouth. And I was like, how did he get from this to this? But it was so well done and so poignant. I absolutely loved that episode. I was doing something with my day job, and my buddy, who also listens to your show, he goes, "You got to listen to this one right away." And I'm like, I'm not the biggest Soundgarden fan. He goes, "Listen to this episode now." And I'm like working earbuds in, and I'm like, "Holy crap, this is amazing." So kudos to you, sir.
Thanks. That was one of the first ones back. Like I had like a couple months to think about that one, which is dangerous sometimes, but like maybe it worked a little better in that case. It's that one ended up being, we lost Chris Cornell like a couple years ago. The guy from Smash Mouth had just died like a month or two ago, and who was the other? No Rain, right? Like Blind Melon. Like people had been asking me to do or to talk about Blind Melon, No Rain for a long time. And so that episode got heavier than I had anticipated, but it ended up being about like, people, rock stars, songs you love, even if they become memes, a little bit in the Smash Mouth case, but then, like the singer dies, and it changes the way you hear the song, and maybe you give a little more grace, to Steve Harwell, to the Smash Mouth guy than you did before when he was just like, the Shrek of it all. Right. I think can turn that song into literally a cartoon. And that's not to say that like, All Star is like a sad, mournful song now. Like not at all. It's a great song, and it's a silly, ridiculous song, but it gives a little more depth and a little more humanity to it. And it was really cool to try, and connect those dots like that. Thank you very much. It's really cool to hear, if that worked out okay.
Yeah, to a similar extent, that I just recently came back around to Counting Crows because of the bear.
Ooh, yeah, that's right.
I had written off the Counting Crows because of Shrek. So similar reasons.
That's right.
Yeah.
Shrek, man. Shrek will get you. Shrek giveth and Shrek taketh away. Yes.
Is there any band from the 90s that you may have written off in the past, you've come back around to now and you appreciate more now?
Sure. Yeah. I was worried when I started this that I'd go back to the music I loved and not love it anymore. And that certainly hasn't happened. I'm trying to think of things that I actively disliked. And I don't think there's, but like something like Jane's Addiction, right? Like I think I was a little too young, to totally get Jane's Addiction. And they were like a little too hard for me, as a weenie little 12-year-old or whatever. But like I have a greater appreciation, for them and how foundational they were, the Lollapalooza of it all, like you said, and that was really cool. And so it's cool to go back to bands, where I know this song so well just because I heard it on the radio 8 billion times, but I never really explored the band beyond that song. That's true to Smash Mouth or something like that to an extent. That's true to Blind Melon, certainly. It's again, you either buy the CD or you don't. And if you don't buy the CD, you don't know. The Counting Crows were like that for a while. Like I knew, the same 5 songs that everybody knows, but I didn't get into those records until later, and it's been gratifying to go back and do all that, and have a lot of familiarity, with some of these songs, but to not really know the others at all, and to learn so much, and to gain a deeper appreciation. That's what I was hoping would happen, and that is what happened.
Excellent. So I've got a few questions left. First one being, what's next for Rob?
We got to figure this out, dude. As I have started, I believe this morning, I have started writing the 114th script. We are going to stop at 120. I considered going on again just to be crazy obnoxious, but we got to stop sometime. It would be ideal, I think, to stop doing the 90s. We're going to do another show. I am for sure going to do another podcast. I'm not quite sure what that is. I was just telling somebody, I'm torn between the same sort of format, like X songs that explain X, or doing something completely different. But I don't think I want to lose the storytelling aspect,
right.
The monologuing and the freewheeling, the digressions of it all. I think that's all really important to me. It has to be music just because it has to be music. And so I'm not quite sure what we're going to do next. We have a few ideas, that I like, but we're going to do something, I'm going to take a couple months here and lie on the floor when this is all over, but we're going to go on and we're going to find something else to do, and hopefully a way to apply, a lot of this format, and this approach, to something else, but we'll figure it out soon.
I look forward to it, man. So
me too.
My final question, and this is the question that I ask of all of my guests that do the show. I ask UFC fighters all the way to musicians themselves. With everything that we've dealt with in recent years, what's your advice for making the world a better place tomorrow than what it is today?
Wow. That's a very good question. That's a very profound question. There's a tweet I saw recently that went viral, something like, just keep in mind that everyone you're encountering is completely insane. I think that applies, to this moment, to the last 5-10 years in particular, but I think it always has. And that's especially true, on the internet, on Twitter, for all we talk about Twitter as a wasteland, and it is, but just trying to remember that every person is an actual person, and the other cliche, not just everyone's fighting a battle you know nothing about, right. That kind of thing. Just trying to remember, even if this person is being an asshole and maybe is an asshole, and isn't worth your empathy or your time, which you hopefully figure out very quickly, everyone is struggling, with something, very likely with a version of the thing that you're personally struggling with, and so that was the highfalutin, just take a walk was the first impulse that I had, because that's what I do, right? Again, we're not lockdown type, but we're still in a COVID mindset, we still have reasons to be, and just nothing clears my head or makes me feel better, than just walking around for an hour, listening to an album. And I have no doubt that makes me, a more pleasant person who at least isn't making the world worse for a little while.
Right. Well, let everybody know where they can find you online and your podcast.
Yes. The show, again, is 60 Songs That Explain the 90s, and we're in the final run here. We're in the final 7 or 8 episodes. The book is also called 60 Songs That Explain the 90s. I'm on Twitter, HARVILLA. I'm on Instagram. Just the usual type places. But again, just the emails, the DMs, the feedback that I've received is so cool, and I try and respond to everything. And just that conversation, is just meant the world to me. And that's done wonders for my mental health far and beyond even, walking.
Likewise, my friend. Rob Harvilla, The world is a much better place with you in it. Thanks for doing the show, man.
That's very kind. Thanks for having me. This is awesome. I really appreciate it.
How great was that? 60 songs that explain the 90s can be found on your favorite podcasting platforms. You can also purchase the book online. I know I have one coming my way. I'm really excited to get it. Thank you very much to Rob Harvilla for doing the podcast today. Make sure you give him a follow on all social media platforms. Make sure you're following Caught on the Mic on all social media platforms, or visit me, www.caughtonthemic.com. For all guest inquiries, email caughtonthemic, MIKE, @gmail.com. As we start this new year of 2024, I'm really excited for things that are coming up with Caught on the Mic. So stay tuned, more to come. We have an abundance of nostalgia on the way, plus much, much more. This has been Caught on the Mic with Michael Clark. I'm Michael Clark. Until next time, thank you.